The next infographic that we are going to talk about is graphs. So let's explain what graphs are. Graphs are the most commonly recognized infographic. They do present a large amount of information, and usually it's more in a presentation that is natural to how we think. So it's more of a natural language of the brain. The graph provides visual data metaphors, visual analogies that's used to present this graphing information. So the key thing here is that we use these visual data metaphors, and it's better for those that don't have a personal stake in the information, those casual observers, the casual readers. Those are the heuristic people. But then it also does appeal to the systematic people, and those are the people that are what we would say maybe more serious rather than casual. They do have a personal interest in this information. So the unique thing about graphs is that it does appeal to both categories of readers or viewers. And this is what makes graphs a little bit more rare than some of the other infographic types that we see. So we have 5 different varieties of graphs. We have bar charts or bar graphs. We can interchange these words. We have fever, we have pie, area, and then pictogram. So explaining each one of these in a little bit more detail will come, but just a brief overview. The bar charts or bar graphs show both a statistical and artistic information presentation. So you can present intervals or categories of data. The fever chart is much more statistical, and it presents more of a continuous data. A pie chart is more artistic, and it presents data in relation to a whole. The area chart is partly like a pie, partly like a fever. Those are maybe a little bit more rare. And then we have pictograms, and these are a mix of both pie and bar techniques. So when we look at some examples here, this shows a variety of the different types that we've just mentioned, and you can see that many of these are commonly used in what we would see in our infographics today. So the key thing to remember with all of this is that you have to use this visual inverted pyramid to achieve your maximum potential. So those, looking at the main point being the most obvious, the most important message sent, then those secondary points, and then the supporting details. So also along with this, thinking of those design strategies that we mentioned earlier, the vividness, the organization, the visual data metaphor, and that simplicity of the data metaphor. So what are graphs best suited for? All in all, if we look back at this page, they're really good at summarizing. They're really good at expressing some sort of quantitative relationship. They are least suited for listing specific data. So typically they answer the question how much. Sometimes they'll answer the question what, why, and how. They are often used as sort of that secondary visual element in a design. Sometimes they can be the visual centerpiece, however. Now, with an individual chart or individual graph, typically the size is around 2 to 4 inches wide, but it can vary, and it all depends on the usage. The challenge with a graph is accuracy, and like I said, a lot of times the technique utilized is a visual data metaphor, and also typography. Thinking of the evaluative technology, typography. So the temptation to avoid would be failing to focus on one main point. So let's look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. Starting with the bar chart. So the bar chart, by definition, represents data readings across intervals of time. And so it's represented either with vertical or horizontal bars. And almost any type of data can be told with a bar chart. Like we said earlier, these are very, very common. A couple of key things to think about, though, when we're looking at bar charts is proportions. So there are the proportions or sizes that we need to think about, and we'll talk about this more at the end of this lesson, but thinking of total number of bars that I could utilize, and the number is around 3 to 12, although 12 gets a little high. And each bar, so we're looking at, this is an older graphic, but you can see each bar should be about twice the size as the space in between. Okay, so when you think of how wide should you do your bars, think of the two, twice the size, 2 times the size. The other thing to think about are ratios. So minimum a 3 to 1. So you don't want to basically, go crazy with your ratios. We'll talk about this more again at the end of this lesson. So how do you create it? Obviously we can have these flat bars, but you also can create 3-dimensional bars. However, there is a problem when you use 3-dimensional, and I don't know that I have an example here of one, but what will happen is readers don't know whether they should go, if this was in three-dimensional bar, it looked like a cube, we don't know whether we should go to the top or what appears to be the back. So it's misleading for the viewer. So you do have some options with direction, whether you go vertical or horizontal. And you just have to think of the right way, the proper way to present that information. Make sure that you include labels and that they are consistent. So in this case, we have all of these labels on the outside and they are consistent. Again, I'll show you some do's and don'ts at the end of this lesson with that. So you want to make sure that you highlight a key one key element, one key item. You want to try to include icons because they only help. Be consistent with your width, be consistent with your labels. Don't let charts become obese. Don't let them become overdone. Don't distort relationships, and don't over-label. So here's another example indicating visually where these percentages are, which is a great thing for the viewer to identify very quickly. Another example, this is almost getting into the use of pictograms, where we're looking at an information but with some visuals that help us see it a little bit better. Again, labeling is fairly consistent. One of the things we want to look for also is over on the measurement, where we're looking at intervals, that there's no unusual gap, because that distorts reality. On to fevers. So one more. So we have, again, a different way to present it. And with looking at some of the newer infographics, people are becoming very creative with ways to present information. Of course, using icons that tell the story so that you have limited amount of text. So fever charts, sometimes these are called line charts. So they report more of a progress across a continuous range such as time. And so it's assumed that they're on a continuous scale. And, you would connect these sort of points with a line, and that's where we get line or the fever. So, if we're looking at temperature readings, a lot of times they're presented in a line or a fever chart. So the fevers versus the bars, what we just looked at. So bars are more measurements that occur in what we would say more of a stair-step fashion or interval scales, whereas fevers are more in a linear fashion, a continuous scale. So do you put dots in or do you not put dots in? And that's the question. Dots do indicate that observations were made at that point in time, at that implied interval. It's exactly at that point. So it just depends on how you're presenting your fever. And then filled or not filled, they mean different things. So when we have an unfilled, it would be like specific readings where it would be at that time. Now a filled means that it includes all of that amount, all of the amounts from 0, which is at the bottom, all the way up to where my fever or my line or my point is. So when you're in doubt, should I fill it, should I not fill it, it's better to unfill. So here's an unfilled one, and you can see I do have some dots or points here indicating certain things. It just actually is not giving me an exact number, but it's just pointing out clearly where what is what. Here we're getting some exact numbers here. So maybe a little misleading with our numbering labeling system on this one, but you get the idea, and it's a continuous. You can see it's through a time span. Pie charts are the next, and pie charts do a percentage. So we have the pie chart equals 100%. When we do this using pie charts, it shows more of that relationship to the whole, because circles convey that sense of completion, a sense of a group or a whole. So that's what pie charts really excel in. You typically point out one quantity that relates to this whole. Okay, so you have to think of 100% equaling 360 degrees, and then when you're creating them, what percentage is what degree. So when we use pie charts, we have full, partial, and exploded. So the full pie chart shows the full. The partial leaves the non-essential slices out. And then the exploded emphasizes key slices by moving them away from the other lesser slices. So the key thing here, then we can combine, explode, and we can also shade them. But the key thing is to look at them in perspective. So sometimes people will throw these into perspective, and that can really reduce the accuracy. This is one of those ways that charts can lie. You can make it lie very easily by throwing a pie in perspective, because the perspectives, the percentages will look off depending if it's towards the front or if it's towards the back. So when used properly, it can be very valuable and a great tool, but used incorrectly, it can not do what it's supposed to do. It can be, comes into kind of some of that ethics of design. Uncluttered or cluttered. So we have to make sure that we don't put in too many slices. And we might want to combine categories to make something called other. So here's an example, kind of backtracking a moment and looking at what that 8% is. So 8% looks pretty large there because of the way that we've got this exploded. Distorting reality is not always good. So here's an example where we talk about, almost a cluttered. If you look at all of these tiny pieces, this becomes a problem because the slices get too thin and it's harder to read. It takes a lot longer to read than what it's supposed to. So be careful with those super, super thin, tiny, tiny slices, and like I said, put them into combining them into some sort of an other. Here are some examples that are more graphic. So should you shade them? How do I deal with color? In this case, there really is no color. Here we can see that when we get a ton of different slices, it becomes very difficult to start distinguishing, oh yeah, that's a shade of blue, but that's a shade of blue, and my eyes aren't really good, or I'm not very good lighting, or my monitor's not very good. It's hard to distinguish that, this blue here is not the same blue as this here. So you have to be careful with that. Like I said, here's an example that's much more graphic. Does it show what it's intended to show? Probably. Is it accurate? Maybe not, because we've got sort of a three-dimensional thing thrown in. But does it have to be accurate for this? Probably not. So you have to think about that. Now, you have to also make sure that things are labeled clearly. If there's no room, then you separate some of that information into another area. So you want to make sure that you are highlighting one key slice. What's the purpose of this? Highlighting that key slice, simplifying that data, making them be labeled efficiently, including this visual vividness that most like. And so be careful that you don't distort this and that you don't make too big of a pie. Here's another example. Again, where we're showing percentages, it's thrown in a little bit of perspective, not a whole lot, so I think it seems to be fairly accurate. Area charts are the next piece, and these really are a mix, kind of a multiple fever. It's sort of a complex thing that's very difficult to understand for most. So they're presenting multiple fever lines all at the same time, each using each other as a 0 point. This gets to be hard, like I said, to understand, and so you maybe need to build in some sort of visual clues to explain to readers. It's not just a simple multi-line fever, and you kind of sometimes have to go overboard on labeling things. So you want to make sure you're simplifying that data, like always. You want to make sure you label it, and you might want to consider separate, fever or pies to explain this a little bit more. Okay, so if you start to put too much into this, though, into these areas, you really get confusing. So be careful with these. I would say they're probably used not very often. And here's an example, too. So what is this telling us? We really don't know. This is hard to read. Here where we get a little bit of indicators, so we've got those fevers with some points in there, and then the area underneath is what we're including. Again, we have some visuals that help define areas, which is good. Pictograms are basically these icons that we like to see. So bar charts, pie charts, I've shown both of them with some icons. So when you use pictograms, extremely quick to read. They're very much more memorable because we tend to have those pictures stuck in our head more than we would hard facts and text. You want to make sure that the visuals are proportional to the quantity reported. Okay. And a lot of times with the icons, you use one and then you duplicate it many times to indicate. Now, what you don't want to do here, you want to make sure you're keeping these icons simple so that we avoid the use of a key, that little box that tells us what things mean. We don't want to use those. You might want to indicate main point with a pointer box. That's what's happening here. A pointer box indicating or highlighting or pointing us to one specific piece of information. So one of the things with this, though, is we don't want to enlarge or reduce the icons to show fractional quantities. Instead, it's better to sort of chop them. So a couple of other examples here where we see, these are more of a slider pictogram here because, the ends are all the same. It's just been slid up, so it's part bar with the pictures on it. So creatively displays that information. Here's an example of the pie, again, using some icon relationship, and they're telling us how, people or the students are expected to spend their money. Sad to say, a big chunk of it looks like it's for pizza or food. So this gives us an icon of what we are. But now, we'd want to describe them because we might not understand what some of those icons or pictograms mean. Here's another example. Again, we're showing some icons along with our pie. Now this is pretty complex. There's multi-layers here, which can be a little bit tricky to read. So those people that are interested are going to go and read it. Those that aren't might back away a little bit. So now when we move on to distorting reality, I mentioned this with a lot of them, how we have to be careful not to distort the reality that's in the chart. So we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail and indicate what's the proper way, what's the proper amount for the bar proportions, the ideal ratios, the vertical versus horizontal bars, labeling, dots or no dots, filled or unfilled, and how we can really throw off the information. So looking at the bar proportions, like I mentioned earlier, we want to have them 2 to 1. And each bar should be the same width. The space between the bars should be roughly equal to half of that width. That's the rule there. The ideal ratio. So we don't want to sort of lose the dramatic impact by having these bars really long. So bars tend to distort the data when their height reaches a certain point. So we want to make sure that the height, is about 20 to 25 times the space between each bar. And here you can see this is 20 and this is 25. And you can see these are getting pretty long. So you have to be careful with that. Now looking at the perspective piece, you have to be really careful, because if I were to say, where does the grid intersect? Where does this grid intersect the bar? If we're using a plain bar, flat, 2D, you can see that, well, it's right here. This is the top of my amount. But we're in 3D, we're wondering, where is it? Is it going to be here? Is it going to be here? Is it somewhere in the middle? So you have to be cautious that it's difficult to place these on a grid. You might want to then include a label with the exact amount if you choose to use 3D. Looking at vertical versus horizontal, which way should we go? So when you're looking at vertical, basically the time or the progressive scale goes toward on the bottom. Okay, this is the independent item, and then the quantity or the value that's measured is on the vertical, and this is the dependent. This is what you're measuring. So that is the orientation for vertical. Now horizontal, you sort of flip that. And so if your bars are going from left to right, this is your quantity or your value, your dependent, and the category is the independent. So that's the thing that, is measured in terms of. Okay? Now, appropriate use of labeling. This is really important because you want to be, number one, consistent. And so you should consistently either go inside or outside the bars. Don't do a half and half. And the labels should appear next to the bars, not far away from them. So here's an appropriate or up at the top, inappropriate at the bottom. So appropriate, all outside, and categories are all inside in this example. And the values, making the A, B, and C, but if I'm going to put those inside, then they all have to be inside. Okay, so, and then you can do categories above, but again, be consistent. So the inappropriate would be half in, half out. Putting everything in, there just won't be enough room. And then here we're too far away, so I'm trying to figure out how far this is. I've got to try to keep my eye in a straight line to go over to see where that amount is located. Now the dots, where do we place the dots? Do we put dots in there, dots or no dots? So we put dots exactly on points, and this is if you have those specific points. Now if you have those exact readings. Now if you don't, then you might more estimate with these. Okay. Now here, do we fill it? Do we not fill it? So we talked about when it's including all of the values from 0 on up, then we would fill. If it's only the specific values that I'm marking, then you would not fill. When in doubt, it's best just to not fill. And here's a distorting. This one I think shows really pretty well, looking at how a pie chart can really throw off that information. So when I look at this, 5% here over on the side versus 5% towards me, which of course is going to be larger because of the perspective, that throws it off. And so we want to make sure that we're using our ethics and showing things correctly. One of the things you'll see if you start looking a lot at pie charts specifically that have been thrown into 3D, into a perspective, they have been distorted, and sometimes people will use that to their advantage. And the last, dealing with some of our icons, make sure that you are depicting an amount with that icon. And again, don't stretch or shorten, just chop it off. If they need to have a partial amount, then you just cut that icon. That's the best method. So looking at an infographic and the pieces that should go into your infographic when you build one, there's a bunch. Of course, you need to have a headline. It would be nice to have a paragraph of text that explains what the infographic is about. References, footnotes, giving credit to all sources, specifically where you're getting your information from. You always want to credit your source. Using pictograms, the strong visual hierarchy, the grid system. Always start with a grid when you're building your infographics. All charts should have titles so it's clear what the data is represented. Make sure that you're labeling on the charts and the graphs, you're labeling on the pies. You're using a color palette, a cohesive color palette. Think of a complementary color scheme or an analogous color scheme. Look at the color schemes out there and find there are many that are built for you to help you with that. And then the typography. The rule is really 2 fonts per design. That's really what we live in graphic design. So make sure that you're not giving a whole bunch of different fonts, and typography is crazy. So here's just an example of the anatomy of an infographic. And so you can see that we have, some pictograms out here. We're going to talk about maps coming up. We've got icons. We've got a cohesive color palette throughout. We've got a little descriptive text here with our large headline. And remember the reading gravity. We start in the top left corner. So that reading gravity, we just navigate to this corner first. And so that might be a proper location for a headline. The labels are really clear, easy to read. So those are all things to think about. And last but not least, making sure that you do credit your sources, put your references there. So there's a little bit about infographics. We see lots of our graphs category in infographics. So these are something that you should start looking at and thinking about how you can build them.